It's important to know a little bit about our organization, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, and to put a little bit of perspective on things. I think it's very important. Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting started in 2006, and since the beginning, our focus has been on China. And I think it's important to just educate both the public and physicians around the world about this here. Well, I'm going to repeat a lot of the things that was stated here by our panelists. One of the most simple reasons is China is the only country in the world that allows the practice of forced organ harvesting from prisoners to exist. There is no other country. China is also the fastest growing transplant country in the world. It transplants the most amount of organs, besides the United States, in the world. They're number 2. And according to China's official statistics, more than 1 million people in China need organ transplantation every year. China continues to also be a major center for transplant tourism, even though they've tried to put this to an end. China has also officially failed at formally introducing a public organ donation program. And as mentioned by our panelists before, even the Red Cross, a 1-year pilot, failed miserably. One major reason that the panelists had already recognized why it's so difficult is it's actually very taboo for Chinese people to be buried without all their organs in place. In fact, one of the things that they tried to implement in China, like we have here in the United States, is that if on their driver's license they check something that says that you can take their organs, that they would be available as an organ donor. However, in China, it was quickly passed around that this is actually be a curse. And many people believed in China that if they checked that, it was an actual curse. You can see the difficulties it is for a formal organ public donation program to actually exist. China also continues to admit that the vast majority of organs used for transplant comes from executed prisoners. As our previous panelist said, this is fact. This is not something we're making up. This is coming from China themselves. Even their Vice Minister of Health is saying this. China is also the only place in the world that offers patients in need of organs the opportunity to obtain an organ within the time frame of weeks, not months, not years. Even in the United States, we recognize ourselves as probably one of the countries on the forefront of transplant medicine. However, even in the United States, it's months to years of waiting list, even for kidneys. But in China, they often boast that it can take weeks. According to
I started volunteer work partially because a long-time family friends. My father is a professor, came here in the 1980s and taught at Rutgers, and we have a long-time neighbor who is a Fulbright scholar in physics, and she was put into the labor camp because of her doing the practice of for health. And her daughter, who is a professor of biology at the University of Texas, called me and saying that her mother was sent to a labor camp because she refused to sign the paperwork to denounce the practice. And my first exposure to Falun Gong was in 1994 when I was in Beijing visiting my friends at the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And I had friends working there, and when I was there, they were doing all the meditation in the office. At the time, I thought they were sleeping in the office, and I said, how come you get paid and sleep in the office? And they were telling me that they were doing the Buddhist meditation called Falun Gong, and that was my first exposure. Later on, the Chinese Consulate General in New York started organizing teaching seminars of the practice and to Americans and overseas Chinese students as part of the propaganda scheme to promote Chinese culture to the West. The presentation that I'm giving actually is part of the presentation I gave at the European Parliament when I was at Stockholm University. I just added a little bit. And I will just try to address 3 things. What is Falun Gong and why it's being persecuted? And why are these detainees vulnerable as organ source? So first,
the thing is, there is much, it's very important, much less regulatory oversight in China. Quite frankly, it's been actually referred to as far as clinical trials as the Wild West. the issues that we deal with in the FDA, the EMA, Health Canada, they just don't exist in China. It's just much easier to get things done. There's much less scrutiny. Therein, of course, lies part of the problems. Now, as far as the specific area of clinical trials in organ transplant studies, very simply, I see my role now going forward, at this time and going forward, is to educate the biotech, pharmaceutical, and medical device industry to a greater degree about the dubious source of the organs that are being used for transplantation in China and subsequently for clinical trials. Clinical trials are the backbone of the development and the treatment of patients in transplantation. Those of us who've been around, in fact, you mentioned 1981 when I first started at the University of Miami, when the program started. That's really scary. But that's the year the cyclosporin was approved for use as immunosuppression. It was the first real breakthrough, and it was life-saving. But if you look at the number of drugs subsequent to cyclosporin that have been approved over the last 30 years, and for those of us sitting in the audience that remember back to 81, there hasn't been that many. There's always some problems. So this is an area that's continuing to grow, and eventually the care and the efficacy and the safety of these drugs, and safety is a big issue here because these are very toxic, dangerous drugs. But of course the patients need them in order to prevent rejection. If you put this all together, China looks at first blush like a very fertile ground to conduct these studies. However, it's my feeling now, and it's my formal position as far as my company is concerned, and the work that I do, I consider just like making comments about protocol development or enrollment numbers and incidences of serious adverse events based on my experience. That's all a big part of my job. I see now as a center point of my job.
A stop period. We could say we don't move until they don't take anything from China until it's stopped. Although I might like that, it kind of fits into my kind of righteous feeling about how we should do it. I realize, practically speaking, it would be extraordinarily difficult. It would like putting an international embargo on something, like embargoing Iran or embargoing some other good. It's hard to make it happen because someone else will kind of. It's very hard to get that international, clear-cut international agreement to do something about it. So, although I might want that, or we might want that, I think it's unlikely that it'll actually happen. We have a problem because there are Chinese professionals who want to develop other practices. The Chinese Red Cross, we know, is trying to develop a donation after cardiac death by our standards. There are those who want to try and develop a decent standard. So I think we should try to provide support for Chinese transplant professionals who work to put an end to a practice. I think what we're left to doing is being very, 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 very careful. Carefully select those data which are acceptable by international norms and do our best to be sure, as much as we possibly can, the data from executed prisoners, and I should also say vended living donors, because there's plenty of that going on too, does not get into our literature, into our meetings, into our textbooks, and into our training. And similarly, I absolutely agree with the comments about pharmaceutical companies, that we must use all our influence in pharmaceutical companies, and we do have some, and we have had some cooperation to get pharmaceutical companies to stop doing clinical trials on Chinese transplants when the source of the donors is unclear to them, because they wouldn't get away with that in the United States or in Europe, and why should they get away with that in China? But I don't know the right answer, I really don't. All I can say that if we do nothing, we will share in the guilt.
2010, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Very accomplished. He's also the co-author of the investigative report called Bloody Harvest, The Killing of Falun Gong for Their Organs. The subject Mr. Mattis will address before you today is the ethics of medical participation in anti-rejection drug trials in China, and elaborate more of what he did on his poster speech, which he won the Blue Ribbon for yesterday. Please welcome David Mattis.